Have you ever seen a person step off a train, and with just one look the whole town stops breathing? In Dust Valley, a dry and lonely land, a middle-aged man who has lived his whole life in silence and loss has staked his last hope on a mail-order marriage, but he doesn't know. What awaits him is not a strange wife, but a woman who carries a truth powerful enough to shatter the peace of this town. One is looking for refuge, the other is looking for himself, and both are faced with a choice to face it bravely or to run away forever. If it were you in the middle of a lonely desert and the judgmental looks of the whole town, would you open your heart to a stranger with a secret, or close the only door that could save your life? This story is for anyone who has been hurt, has been afraid, has longed for a chance to start over. We invite you to join their journey. If the story touches you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to accompany each other through emotional stories. The heat settled over Dust Valley the way a tired horse leans into its last breath. Thick, still, unmoving. By the time the 515 westbound was due, the sun had already dropped low enough to turn the windows of the station house into panels of gold. The tracks hummed quietly, carrying the faint promise of steel wheels rolling from faraway cities. Dust puffed up from the ground in soft clouds, drifting as slow as old memories. Elias Merrick stood alone on the wooden platform, as he always did, as the town expected him to. 52 years old, shoulders broad from ranch work, but posture softened by grief, he looked like a man who had lived half his life in silence. His hat, a weathered, sweat-stained Stetson, cast a long shadow over eyes that had once been bright. Now they carried a kind of quiet that made people step around him instead of toward him. His hands rested at his sides, heavy and uncertain. Every few breaths he rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he never broke after the day he buried his son. The people of Dust Valley drifted around the station as if pulled there by wind rather than purpose. There was always a crowd whenever something unusual happened. And a man ordering a bride through the mail was more unusual than a month of rain out here. Clara Winslet, owner of the general store, sat on a bench, fanning herself lazily. Theo Klein, the blacksmith, leaned on the hitching post, his expression caught somewhere between concern and sympathy. Sheriff Boyd Halpern stood with his thumbs tucked under his belt, the sun gleaming off the badge on his chest like an unearned decoration. They all pretended not to look at Elias, but every eye waited for the same thing. The train. A soft whistle curled through the air, mournful and long. Elias straightened by instinct, tugging the front of his faded shirt, brushing the dust from his trousers. He had bathed, shaved, and even brushed his boots that morning. It didn't matter what a man told himself, hope had its own way of rising, quiet but stubborn. The train rounded the bend in the distance, its black engine cutting through the light like a dark memory returning. Steam rolled up, catching the orange of dusk as if the sky were letting go of fire. Elias exhaled. He didn't know what kind of woman had answered his letter. He didn't know if she'd stay a day or an hour. He didn't know if he was a fool. But he knew loneliness well enough to make a choice. And so he waited, heart steady, hands trembling. The engine hissed loud as it slowed to a stop. Passengers stepped down, traveling salesmen with overpacked cases, miners smelling of sweat and ambition, a mother carrying a child asleep on her shoulder. But none of them looked like someone arriving to become another man's new beginning. A flicker of doubt crawled up Elias's spine. Had she changed her mind? Had she read about the drought? About Dust Valley's failing wells? About him? He shifted his weight. His boots creaked. Sheriff Boyd chuckled under his breath. Then, the last passenger car door slid open with a tired squeal. For a moment, no one stepped out. Just shadows. Only shadows. Then a single foot appeared, a woman's boot polished clean, far cleaner than anything that had touched the dust of this valley in years. She stepped down carefully, one hand gripping the rail, the other carrying a small traveling case the color of old whiskey. When she lifted her head, the entire platform fell silent. Her dress wasn't extravagant but well kept. A soft gray with a high collar, sleeves neatly pinned. Her hair tied back in a simple knot caught the last strands of sun like threads of copper. Her posture was calm, almost still, like someone who had learned to anchor herself against storms many times before. She wasn't young the way folks expected a mail-order bride to be, but she carried a dignity that made her presence feel grounded, solid, like the earth itself had been waiting for her. Her eyes searched the platform, slow, thoughtful, almost cautious. When they met, Elias's, something shifted in the air. Not recognition, not relief. Something quieter, a softness that lasted only a heartbeat before disappearing. She stepped fully onto the platform, and the dust at her feet folded away, as if even it respected her arrival. Elias opened his mouth, but all that came out was a dry breath. The woman spoke first. Her voice was steady, warm, but worn at the edges by miles traveled and things left unsaid. "Mr. Elias Merrick." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. That's me." She offered a small, thoughtful smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "My name is Margaret Rowe," she said. "You may call me Maggie." He swallowed. His nerves pressed against his ribs. "It's good to meet you, ma'am." A whisper carried through the onlookers. Sheriff Boyd muttered something under his breath, but Clara Winslet shot him a look sharp enough to cut rope. Maggie glanced at the crowd, her expression unreadable. Something like caution flickered in her gaze, but she hid it well. Elias stepped forward, awkwardly. "Can I carry your things?" he asked. She looked down at her single case, then back at him. "This is all I brought." "All right then," he managed. "My wagon's out front." They began walking side by side, but with a polite distance between them. The wooden planks creaked under their steps, each sound stretching into the quiet like echoes in a long hallway. The townsfolk parted as they passed, not with welcome but with curiosity dressed up as courtesy. At the edge of the platform, Elias paused, suddenly aware of something strange. Maggie was trembling just barely, as if the wind wasn't warm at all but cold enough to cut bone. She caught him looking and steadied her breath. "Long journey," she said softly. "Takes a moment to find your footing after so many miles." He nodded, accepting her explanation even though he sensed something deeper. A story she wasn't ready to tell, a story that clung to her shoulders like an invisible weight. He led her toward the wagon. The sun dipped lower behind the mesas, scattering red light across the valley floor. As Maggie climbed onto the seat, she paused, hands resting lightly on the worn wood. "Thank you for coming," Elias said quietly. She looked at him for a long second, long enough for him to feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. Then she answered just as quietly, "Thank you for sending the letter." The wagon rolled out of the station wheels, crunching over gravel. Behind them, Dust Valley watched in near holy silence, as if the town itself sensed that something had shifted, something small, something tender, something that might grow if given the right kind of time, or break, as fragile things often do. And though neither of them knew it yet, the moment Maggie Rowe stepped off that train, the story of Dust Valley and Elias Merrick's life had already begun to change. Forever. The road from Dust Valley Station to the Merrick Ranch stretched 12 long miles, but that evening it felt even longer. The wagon wheels rolled slow and steady over the dirt path, carving soft grooves into the earth that had forgotten what it felt like to hold moisture. Sagebrush leaned in the wind like old men bowing to time. The sun hung low on the horizon, staining the desert in shades of amber and rust. For a while, Elias and Maggie rode in silence. Not the awkward kind, not the cold kind, just the quiet that often lives between two people who haven't yet learned the shape of each other's presence. The mule snorted, the leather straps creaked, and Maggie held her traveling case on her lap the way someone holds onto the last thing they trust. Elias stole a glance at her. She sat upright, hands folded neatly, her profile softened by the fading light. There was a calmness about her, but also a tension like a drawn bow held steady by sheer force of will. "Hope the ride's not too rough," Elias said, finally, voice low. "It's smoother than I expected," Maggie replied. "I've ridden worse roads for reasons far less hopeful." He nodded, though he didn't fully understand what she meant. Her tone carried weight. A history. Something left behind but not forgotten. After another stretch of silence, Maggie spoke again, her voice gentler this time. "This valley, it's quieter than I imagined." Elias gave a faint smile. "Dust Valley's always been quiet. Some folks say it keeps secrets better than people do." "And do you believe that?" He hesitated, then answered honestly, "Used to think so. Now I'm not sure." Maggie looked down at her hands, thumb brushing across the handle of her travel case. "There's comfort in quiet," she murmured. "Even uncomfortable kinds of quiet." Her words carried something fragile, and Elias sensed she wasn't speaking about Dust Valley anymore. He didn't push her. He wasn't that kind of man. Years of grief had taught him to respect the weight of silence, especially the kind that trembles beneath someone's breath. They rode on. The sun dipped behind the mesa, casting long shadows that stretched across the land like dark fingers reaching for the remains of daylight. A coyote cried somewhere in the distance, one lonely note that drifted across the desert like a reminder that life still clung to this harsh place. Maggie watched the horizon. "There's so much sky here," she said quietly. "Where I come from, the buildings get in the way. Here it feels like the sky presses right against your heart." Elias nodded again. He liked how she saw things. Most folks came to Dust Valley and complained about the dryness, the wind, the emptiness. But Maggie saw the sky, and the sky was the only thing out here that never lied. "Where did you live?" before he asked gently. She paused, a longer pause than before. "A little town near the Missouri River," she answered. "Nothing special. Just full of memories I couldn't keep carrying." Her voice didn't break, but it wasn't steady either. Elias felt something twist softly in his chest. He understood that kind of leaving. Leaving not because you want to. Leaving because staying hurts too much. "I'm sorry," he said simply, and Maggie's shoulders eased just a little, as if those two words had loosened a knot she'd held for too long. "Thank you," she whispered. Dust settled behind the wagon wheels like a long, pale ribbon. The air cooled, carrying the faint scent of juniper and dry grass. They were nearing Merrick land, now the turnoff marked by an old fence post leaning so far it looked ready to surrender. Elias pulled the reins lightly. "We're close," he said. "A few more minutes." Maggie nodded, but her eyes stayed on the land. She was studying it not with curiosity but with an attentiveness that reminded Elias of ranchers inspecting fields at dawn. "Your land stretches all the way to that ridge?" she asked softly. "Yes, ma'am. About 30 acres total. Most of it's gone dry now, but—" He cleared his throat. "It used to be good land." She didn't offer pity. She didn't offer advice. She simply said, "Drought takes more than water. It takes pieces of a person." Elias swallowed. "That it does." For the first time, Maggie turned fully to look at him. "And yet you stayed," she said softly. "That says something." He didn't know how to answer that, so he didn't. The wagon moved on, creaking under the weight of stories neither of them were ready to tell. The closer they got to the ranch, the quieter Elias became. His hands tightened on the reins, not from fear but from nerves he didn't know how to name. It had been years since someone new rode this road with him. Years since a woman sat beside him on this wagon. Years since hope felt this close. When the ranch finally came into view, the last of daylight brushed it in soft gold. The barn leaned slightly to the right, roof patched with mismatched shingles. The house, a modest two-story with worn siding, stood with the resilience of something honest, weathered and still standing. A windmill creaked slowly, turning just enough to prove it wasn't dead. Maggie studied everything with that quiet, attentive gaze. "It's humble," she said gently, "but it feels lived." Elias breathed out, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. "Place has its years," he said. "Ain't perfect, but it's home." She gave a small smile, one that wasn't polite or cautious but real. Home doesn't need to be perfect. Her words struck deeper than she likely meant them to. They reached the front of the house. Elias hopped down, boots thudding against dry earth, then turned to offer Maggie a hand. She hesitated just for a second, but then placed her palm in his. Her hand was warm, steady, a little calloused, which surprised him. "Careful now," he murmured as she stepped down. "I'm all right," she answered softly. But their hands lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Then Maggie stepped back and looked at the house again, this time with something close to resolve settling over her features. "Shall we?" she asked. Elias nodded and lifted her case from the wagon. As they walked toward the front steps, the wind seemed to hush around them. The house, the land, the sky, all of Dust Valley felt like it was holding its breath. Because the moment Maggie Rowe entered that house, the life of Elias Merrick would begin to unravel and rebuild in ways neither of them could foresee. They did not know it yet, but healing had a way of finding two broken people when they stopped running long enough to be found. Evening had settled over Dust Valley by the time Elias pushed open the front door. The hinges gave a low groan, the kind that came from years of holding on rather than giving in. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of dry wood, cold stone, and memories that hadn't moved in years. Maggie stepped across the threshold, pausing just inside the doorway as if letting her eyes adjust not only to the dimness but to the life she was about to share, if only in name, with a man she barely knew. The house wasn't large, but it held stories in every corner. The living room opened into a small dining area, and beyond that, the kitchen with its worn counter and a stove Elias had patched 3 times. The walls were simple pine boards, some faded lighter from sun exposure through the windows, others darker from the passage of time. Maggie stood quietly, hands folded before her, gaze moving slowly from one object to the next. A pair of worn boots near the door, a framed sketch of a boy with a gap between his teeth, a faded quilt draped over the back of a chair. She didn't ask, but she understood, the way a mother understands without needing answers. Elias cleared his throat. "It ain't much," he said softly, "but it stands strong. 'Bout all I've managed to keep that hasn't blown away." Maggie turned toward him, her expression gentle. "It's a home," she said. "Homes don't have to be more than that." He nodded, grateful for the way she phrased it. Most people who stepped foot into his house used words like small, old, or bare. But Maggie used home, and somehow that made the room warmer. Elias motioned to the stairs. "Your room's up here," was the spare, but I cleaned it out best I could. Maggie followed him up the narrow staircase, each step creaking softly under their feet. A faint draft drifted through the upstairs hallway, carrying the scent of the desert night, cool, dry, and touched with sage. At the end of the hall, Elias pushed open a door. "This'll be yours," he said. The room was simple, containing only a bed, a small dresser, and a washstand with a ceramic bowl and pitcher. A single window looked out toward the open valley, where the last streaks of sunset stretched across the sky in muted red. Maggie stepped inside, setting her traveling case gently at the foot of the bed. She didn't speak for a long moment. She simply walked to the window, resting one hand lightly on the sill. "It's peaceful," she said quietly. "Some nights more than others," Elias replied. She glanced back at him. He didn't elaborate. She didn't push. Maggie turned back toward the room, smoothing the quilt with her hand. "Separate rooms suit us for now," she said. "I think it best you rest without feeling obliged to adjust too quickly." Elias's ears warmed. "Reckon that makes good sense," he answered. "It does," she said. "Good sense makes people kinder to themselves." He didn't know what to say to that, but her tone felt like cool water poured over a wound he'd hidden for years. Not a cure, but a comfort. After showing her where she could wash, Elias stepped back into the hallway. "I'll let you settle. If you need anything, well, you can just call for me." Maggie gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Merrick." He hesitated at the doorway. "Elias," he said softly. "You can call me Elias." Her eyes met his. Calm, steady. Then "Good night, Elias." "Good night, Maggie." He carried the sound of her saying his name with him as he went downstairs. It rested in his chest in a way he hadn't expected. Elias started a small fire in the stove to warm the house. He moved around the kitchen with the familiarity of a man who had done everything alone for too long, measured steps, quiet movements, no wasted motion. He poured himself a cup of boiled water, warmed with a splash of leftover coffee. He sat at the table. The room felt different. Not full, not loud, just not as empty. His gaze drifted toward the staircase. Maggie Rowe, a woman who seemed both fragile and unbreakable at the same time, who spoke softly but held her shoulders like someone who had learned to stand through storms. He didn't know what she carried with her, but he knew it was heavy. And for the first time in years, Elias felt a pull, a quiet wanting to understand another person's pain, not because it mirrored his own, but because hers looked so carefully folded that touching it might unspool something too deep to ignore. He set the cup down, rubbing the back of his neck. "Easy now," he muttered to himself. "Ain't no sense rushin'." But the truth was simple. Her presence unsettled the dust inside him in ways he had forgotten dust could be unsettled. Upstairs, Maggie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. The room held a stillness she wasn't accustomed to. Real stillness. Not fear. Not hiding. Just quiet. She looked around the room. The worn dresser. The simple quilt. The rough pine walls. For a moment she closed her eyes, letting the silence settle over her shoulders like a shawl. Dust Valley was quieter than she'd expected. Quieter than any place she had been in years. And that frightened her, not because she disliked quiet, but because quiet gave space for memories to speak. And Maggie had memories she spent years trying not to hear. She opened her traveling case. Inside were only a few dresses, a small comb, and a folded piece of cloth wrapped around something fragile. Her fingers hovered over it. She didn't open it. Not tonight. Instead, she stood and paced slowly around the room, her thoughts drifting toward the man downstairs. Elias Merrick. Kind eyes worn by grief. Soft voice that carried more gentleness than he believed he possessed. A man whose sadness didn't make him bitter. A man whose loneliness didn't harden him. She had read that in his letter. Between every line. He had written honestly, simply, without flourish. It was the only reason she'd answered. And yet, standing in his home beneath the vast desert sky, Maggie felt a tremor of doubt. Not about him. Not about the arrangement. About herself. Could a woman with a past like hers fit into a life with a man like him? Could someone bruised by years of running find stillness without breaking it? Would this place swallow her secrets or expose them? She exhaled, slowly, her hand brushing the window frame as the wind whispered outside. Steady now, she murmured to herself. Find your footing. Because she knew the truth. A quiet place could heal, but it could also uncover, and the desert had a way of bringing buried things to the surface. Later, Elias stepped outside to check the horses. The night air cooled the sweat from his brow, carrying the deep, earthy scent of the valley. Stars spilled across the sky in a scatter of silver, and the moon rose pale but steady. He leaned against the post, breathing in the stillness. Behind him, through the window, he could see Maggie moving around the spare room, her silhouette soft in lamplight. She moved with intention, graceful but grounded, as if each step carried a chapter of her story. Elias lowered his gaze. He had the sudden, surprising thought that maybe, just maybe, Maggie wasn't the only one who needed a new beginning. And that Dust Valley, with all its silence and scars, might just be the place where two worn lives could find room to breathe again. But he didn't let the thought linger. Hope was a fragile thing, and he'd learned not to chase it too fast. Instead, he whispered into the night, one step at a time, and the desert seemed to whisper back. Maggie closed her door. Elias finished tending the horses. The wind quieted. The valley held them both in a stillness neither had felt in years. A beginning wrapped itself gently around the night, not loud, not sudden. Just steady enough to be real. They didn't know it yet, but the house in the quiet valley was already shifting into something more than walls and wood. It was becoming a place where broken things might learn how to breathe again. Dawn came slowly to Dust Valley, stretching across the desert like a hand smoothing out a wrinkled blanket. Light crept over the mesas, slid down the slopes, and spilled softly across the Merrick Ranch. It was the kind of sunrise that didn't break the darkness so much as coax it into retreat. Inside the house, the first sound was the quiet clink of enamel dishes. Maggie had risen before the sun. She moved through the kitchen with a calm, practiced grace, no rush, no fumbling. She lit the stove with a match, fed kindling into the small firebox, and added just enough dry wood to keep the flame steady. The scent of heating iron and faint smoke drifted through the room. On the counter sat a tin of coffee beans. Old, a little dusty, but still fragrant when she opened it. Maggie ground them by hand, slow, even turns of the handle. She didn't force the movement. She let it settle into a rhythm, steady as breathing. The quiet scrape of beans turning to grit echoed gently in the still house. Elias had always made his coffee thin and bitter, not out of preference but habit. He didn't expect much from mornings anymore. But Maggie handled the tin as though preparing coffee was a small act of gratitude for the day, as though mornings still held meaning. She poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove. Steam slowly began to rise. Upstairs, Elias stirred. Something unfamiliar hung in the air. Warmth, a subtle aroma of coffee rich enough to make his chest tighten. For a moment he lay still, unsure whether he was still dreaming. Then he heard soft footsteps downstairs. Maggie. He sat up, rubbing his face with both hands. He hadn't meant to oversleep. He usually rose before dawn as ranchers do, but last night, had been different. He had listened to the quiet of his home merging with hers, and somehow sleep had taken him deeper than usual. He stood, washed quickly, and buttoned his shirt with hands that felt clumsy this morning. It had been a long time since another presence in the house made him want to move carefully, respectfully. When he descended the stairs, the scent of brewed coffee grew stronger. Elias paused in the doorway of the kitchen. Maggie stood by the window, sleeves rolled up just enough to show her wrists. Her hair was tied loosely at the nape of her neck. one stubborn strand escaping to catch the morning light. She poured coffee into 2 tin mugs with the calm of someone who had done this thousands of times. She heard him and turned. "Good morning, Elias," she said softly. Her voice carried the gentleness of someone who didn't want to intrude on the house or on him. "Mornin', Maggie," he replied, clearing his throat. "Didn't mean to sleep so late." "You needed rest," she said simply. "The valley keeps long days. You should have something warm before starting them." She handed him a mug. Their fingers didn't touch, but the warmth of the tin felt almost like a shared gesture. Elias took a sip, then blinked. "This is good," he said, surprised. "Real good." Maggie smiled faintly. "Coffee's kinder when made with patience." He let that sit between them, the truth of it deeper than the drink itself. As the light brightened outside, Maggie moved through the kitchen, opening cupboards, checking the pantry. She wasn't nosy, she was assessing the way someone might assess whether a place was safe enough to build a life inside. "You keep things tidy," she said. Elias chuckled. "Tidy enough. Wasn't expecting company." "No one expects company," she answered. "But a man's habits say more about him than his words." He wasn't sure whether that was praise or simple observation. Either way, it settled gently on him. He watched her sort through items on the shelf, a half-filled sack of flour, a tin of salt nearly empty, a jar of beans with only enough left for maybe one stew. Maggie picked up a ledger that was holding up the uneven leg of the kitchen table. "You keep your accounts under furniture," she said mildly. Elias let out a sheepish sigh. "Only place the table sits even." She opened the ledger carefully, flipping through pages yellowed from sun and time. "You're stretched thin," she murmured. "Very thin." Elias looked out the window, shame tightening his jaw. "Drought's been rough. Ram's sick. 2 fences down. Bank's interest keeps climbing like vineweed." "Interest?" Maggie looked up sharply. "How high? 10% every few weeks," he admitted. She closed the ledger slowly. "That isn't interest. That's punishment. It's what they call it at the bank," Elias said, voice low. "Judge Lyman signs off on it." Maggie absorbed that quietly, her expression unreadable. A shadow crossed her, features faint but unmistakable. She set the ledger down. "I'll bake some cornbread later," she said, shifting tone gently. "We have enough to manage for a few days. After that, we'll need to stretch things wisely." Elias looked at her. "You don't need to do all that, Maggie. You're not expected to run my kitchen." "I know." She met his eyes. "But sharing space means sharing burdens. It's how people survive in places like this." Her voice held warmth but also conviction. He nodded. He respected that more than he could say. After breakfast, Maggie stepped outside, adjusting her shawl against the cool morning breeze. The land opened before her, wide, quiet, and aching with possibility. She walked slowly toward the corral, where the fence leaned just a bit too far to the right. She placed her hand on the post, feeling the roughness, the dry, splintering wood. "You've seen years, haven't you?" she whispered. Her voice wasn't to the fence. Not really. It was to the land, the house, the memories, to everything that had endured even when life tried to strip it bare. Behind her, Elias approached, boots crunching softly on dirt. "Fence needs mendin'," he said. "Been meanin' to get to it." She didn't turn. "You worked this place alone, for some years now." "It shows." Her words weren't judgment. They were understanding. She turned toward him. "Elias, may I ask something?" "Sure," he said quietly. "Why did you stay?" He inhaled slowly, studying the distant ridgeline before answering. "This land. It's what I have left, and maybe what I deserve." Maggie held his gaze, her eyes steady and soft. "No one deserves to suffer alone," she said. There was no pity in her tone, just truth spoken gently. Elias felt something shift inside him, subtle like the first crack in a long winter's frost. They walked back toward the house together, their steps unhurried. Inside, Maggie began sorting through what little food they had left, making notes in her mind of what they needed. Elias offered to help, and for the first time in a long while, the house held the quiet sounds of 2 people moving around each other without tension. A soft exchange of glances. Simple words. A rhythm beginning to form. Nothing loud. Nothing rushed. Just the early weaving of companionship. As midday sunlight warmed the windows, Maggie paused at the table, her fingers resting briefly on the worn wood. "This place has a strong foundation," she said almost to herself. Elias looked at her hands, then at her face. "Maybe," he said. "But foundations crack too." She nodded. "They can, but they can also be patched." strengthened. Her eyes softened, made whole again. He held her gaze longer than he meant to, long enough to realize she wasn't talking about the house. By afternoon, Maggie had claimed a small corner of the kitchen, enough space to place her comb, a folded cloth, and a small tin of herbs she carried with her from Missouri. Elias noticed but didn't comment. It felt right, natural, like a seed settling into soil. He stepped outside to tend the horses while she took inventory of the pantry. Their routines had begun to overlap the way branches meet when they grow toward the same sun. Neither of them acknowledged it aloud. Stillness doesn't announce itself. It just arrives. And in the first morning they shared that stillness carried the shape of something tender beginning to stir beneath the dusty floorboards of the Merrick house. Not romance. Not yet. But the first breath of something that might one day bloom if given time, patience, and gentle hands. The afternoon sun drifted lower, softening into a pale gold that touched every plank of the Merrick house. Dust Valley always held its breath at this hour, the in-between hour, when the heat loosened its grip, and the shadows lengthened across the dry earth like dark rivers searching for water. Maggie sat at the small kitchen table, her back straight, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. She hadn't taken a sip in several minutes. Instead, she stared quietly at the swirling dark liquid as if she might find something there she had misplaced long ago. Elias stood at the counter, pretending to retie the twine around a bundle of dried herbs. Clara Winslet had given him weeks back. His hands moved, but his thoughts didn't. He had felt the shift in the room the moment Maggie set the ledger down earlier. A heaviness, not born from the ranch's struggles, not from the drought or the debts. Something older than all of that. He waited. One thing years of loneliness had taught him was this: people speak when they're ready, not when they're asked. After a long stretch of quiet, Maggie set the mug down gently. "There's something I should tell you, Elias." His hands stilled. He turned, leaning back against the counter, giving her space. "All right," he said softly. "You can tell me whatever you choose." She looked at him longer than she had looked at anyone since arriving in Dust Valley. Her eyes were calm but not steady. Something under the surface shifted like a quiet tremor. "I didn't come here only because of your letter," she said. Elias nodded, though the words brushed against something tender inside him. He waited. She continued. "I read many letters, from many men. I could have chosen any of them. But I didn't choose out of chance or convenience." Her fingers tapped lightly on the ceramic mug once, twice before falling still again. "I came because Dust Valley is far from the town where I lived. Far enough that people's whispers can't reach me here. Far enough that their eyes can't follow." Elias straightened slightly. "You runnin' from something?" he asked gently. "Not from something," she said quietly. "From someone. From a place that no longer had room for me." She inhaled, slow and fragile. "In my town, I was blamed for something I didn't do." She paused, gathered herself. A man died. A man with influence. People needed a reason. A name. A face. Her voice thinned. "They chose mine." Elias didn't speak. Didn't blink. "And once people choose a story," Maggie continued, "they hold on to it tighter than truth. Especially when the truth is inconvenient." A long, trembling breath escaped before she added, "I lost friends. I lost work. I lost the home I built with my own hands. One morning I realized the world I lived in had shrunk to a place so small I could barely breathe inside it." Elias's chest tightened, not with judgment but with understanding. He knew how grief could shrink a person's world. How loss could push a man or woman into corners life never meant them to live in. "What really happened, Maggie?" he asked, not to interrogate her, but so she wouldn't carry it alone. She looked down at her hands. "The man who died, he had enemies. Many. The night he passed I was nearby. That was enough for them." Her lips pressed together. "I wasn't guilty. But innocence doesn't always matter when people want something to point at." Her voice softened to barely a breath. "And when the world wants you gone, it doesn't whisper. It shouts." Elias lowered himself into the chair across from her. His boots scuffed the floor, grounding the heavy silence. "You didn't deserve that," he said quietly. Maggie's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "Deserve," she echoed. "It's a heavy word. I don't carry it much anymore." The room dimmed slightly as a cloud passed over the sun outside. The house felt small but not suffocating, more like a shelter from a storm Maggie had been walking through alone for too long. Elias reached out not to touch her hand but to rest his own near it, close enough to say he was there, far enough to respect the space she needed. So he said gently, "You came west to start over." She nodded. "To breathe again. To become someone other than the woman they decided I was." Elias understood that in ways he could never fully express. He had not fled a town, but he had fled everything else. Hope, joy, the version of himself that existed before loss carved him into something quieter. Maggie looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw your letter. And there was something in the way you wrote. Something simple. Something honest. It sounded like a man who didn't want to own someone but to share a life with them. Even if that life was modest. Even if it was broken." Her eyes softened. It was a letter written by someone who had suffered but didn't let the world turn him cruel. Elias swallowed. Her words struck deeper than he expected. "I ain't perfect," he murmured. "I didn't ask for perfect," she replied. "Just a place to stand without being pushed." He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, voice steady, "you've got that here. For as long as you need." Their eyes held each other for a long, quiet moment. Not romantic. Not yet. Just two lives recognizing something familiar in each other, the shape of being hurt and the courage of still being here. Later, after tending the animals, Elias found Maggie stepping out onto the front porch. The dusk light brushed her face in shades of rose and lavender. The wind lifted a few strands of her hair, and she tucked them behind her ear with a motion so careful it made his chest ache. "Dust Valley's peaceful at this hour," she said. "It is," Elias answered. "Most folks don't take the time to notice. I think I could learn to," she whispered. They stood there a while, side by side, not touching, not speaking, just breathing the same quiet evening. Maggie broke the silence first. "I know I said the reason I came was to escape what was behind me, but that's only half the truth." Elias turned. She met his gaze. "The truth is, I came hoping Dust Valley might offer something I forgot how to hope for." "What's that?" Elias asked. "A place to heal." The words hung between them like soft lanterns in the dusk. Elias looked out at the valley, the land scarred by drought, the fence posts leaning the fields dry and tired. "Dust Valley ain't healed yet," he said. "But it's tryin'. Every day it's tryin'." Maggie nodded. "So am I." He didn't smile, not fully, but the corners of his eyes softened. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Tryin' is more than most." The wind shifted. The night deepened. And Elias realized something. Maggie did not come to dust and emptiness. She came to a place waiting for someone who needed its silence. And to a man who, without knowing it, had been waiting for someone who could breathe life into the quiet. Not love. Not yet. But the faint beginning of something that could become love if handled with gentleness and if the past didn't find them first. The door creaked behind them as the evening cooled. Maggie lifted her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you for listening," she said. Elias nodded. "Thank you for telling me." She stepped inside. He lingered a moment longer under the purple sky. And for the first time in years, Elias Merrick felt the quiet around him not as emptiness but as room. Room for healing. Room for truth. Room for someone new. What neither of them knew as the door closed behind Maggie was this: the past she had fled and the past Elias had buried were not done with them yet. And Dust Valley, quiet as it seemed, did not keep secrets as well as people believed. Dust Valley did not welcome strangers. It tolerated them. And in the narrow streets of the town where boards creaked under boots worn thin by years of drought and disappointment, tolerance was often nothing more than quiet suspicion wrapped in good manners. The next morning, Elias hitched the mule and asked Maggie if she wished to ride into town. They needed flour, oil, and maybe a coil of rope if Theo had any left in his shop. But mostly, Elias knew Maggie needed to see the town for herself, needed to step into the place she had chosen as her refuge. "Only if you feel up to it," he said gently. Maggie tied the last knot in her shawl. "I'd like to," she answered. "A person should know the place she hopes to call home." They rode the 12 miles under a soft mid-morning sun. The sky had turned a pale, gentle blue, the kind that reminded Maggie of pressed flowers left inside old books. The mule trotted at a steady pace, its ears flicking at every distant sound, the call of a hawk, the whisper of wind slipping across the dry fields. As they neared town, Maggie straightened her back, eyes sharp but calm. She had learned long ago the importance of first impressions. A woman alone could be seen as prey. A woman with composure could be seen as a question. Dust Valley's main street appeared quiet as always, dust curling under wagon wheels, a few horses tied at the posts, wooden storefronts slouching under the weight of sun and time. But today, something else waited there. Eyes. The kind that tried not to stare but did anyway. Clara Winslet was the first to notice them. She stood outside her general store, sweeping the wooden porch with slow, steady strokes. When she saw Maggie descending from the wagon, she didn't hide her surprise. Her eyebrows rose like the wings of a startled bird, but her smile, warm and familiar, softened the edges of it. "Well now," Clara called out, leaning on the broom handle. "If it isn't the Merrick wagon with a finer sight than usual." Elias flushed slightly. Maggie stepped down with careful grace. "Good morning, Mrs. Winslet," she said. "Oh, hush, with the Mrs." Clara replied, waving her hand. "Clara's fine. You come inside now. Got shade and cool air if you stand in the right corner." Maggie followed Clara into the store. The place was small but tidy, shelves lined with essentials: flour, salt, canned peaches. From the east, bolts of cloth, soap bars, dried beans. Everything smelled faintly of wood, oil, and cinnamon. Clara watched Maggie from the corner of her eye as she moved through the aisles. "You seem the thoughtful sort," Clara said softly. "Most folks breeze through here like they're running from something." Maggie paused at the stack of flour sacks. "We're all running from something," she said gently. "But some of us choose where to stop." Clara's sweeping slowed. A flicker of understanding passed between them, quiet, old, and tender. "Dust Valley's got memories," Clara said. "Most of 'em heavy. But it's kinder than it looks." "I'm hoping for that," Maggie replied. Clara stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You be careful with Judge Lyman." She tapped her temple lightly. "Man remembers everything but the truth. And he's got long reach in this town." Maggie's fingers tightened on the flour sack, but only for a moment. "Thank you for the warning," she said calmly. Clara nodded once. A simple gesture of alliance. Outside, Elias finished loading the wagon when a shadow fell across him. Sheriff Boyd Halpern strolled over, boot heels clicking on the ground like slow, deliberate punctuation. "Mornin', Merrick," Boyd drawled. "And mornin' to your lady friend." Maggie stepped beside Elias, posture dignified, chin lifted just slightly. "Sheriff," she said. Boyd tipped his hat, though the gesture felt more like a habit than a courtesy. "Haven't seen you round these parts before," he said. "Dust Valley's a tight-knit town. Folks like to know who they're sharin' air with." Maggie gave him a small, polite smile. "I'm Margaret Rowe, but you may call me Maggie." "Mail order right?" he asked, a thin smirk spreading across his face. "Word travels quick." Elias stiffened. "That's enough, Boyd." "Oh, relax," the sheriff replied, still smirking. "Just making conversation. We're all neighbors, aren't we? Best to keep things friendly." Maggie didn't flinch. Instead, she met Boyd's gaze with a steadiness that made his smirk falter for a heartbeat. "Friendly isn't always the same as kind," she said softly. A few men nearby chuckled under their breath. Boyd's smirk vanished. "You watch yourself," he muttered. "Towns got rules." "Most towns do," Maggie answered, voice calm. "But not all of them remember why they were made." Elias took a half step forward, ready to intervene, but Maggie touched his arm lightly, steadying him. Just a touch. Yet enough. Boyd stalked off, boots kicking up dust. Elias exhaled long and slow. "You didn't need to go against him," he said quietly. "I didn't," she answered. "I simply didn't bow." He turned to look at her, a mixture of awe and worry in his expression. "You're braver than you let on, Maggie." She shook her head. "No. I just know fear doesn't shrink when you run from it." They visited Theo's blacksmith shop next. Theo wiped sweat from his brow as he stepped out from behind the forge, metal ringing behind him like broken music. "Well, I'll be," he said, smiling wide. "Heard about you, Miss Rowe. Didn't expect you to look Elias in the eye so quick." "I find it's the kindest thing a person can do," Maggie replied. Theo laughed, a warm, hearty sound. "You'll fit in just fine, then." Maggie watched him work for a moment. She admired the strength in his movements, the precision of his hammer descending on hot metal. "You seem a man of steady purpose," she said. Theo grinned. "That or stubbornness. Hard to tell some days." Then lowering his voice, he added, "Watch Boyd, and watch Lyman even more." Maggie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "People seem to say that often," she said. Theo leaned closer. In a town this small, power's loud, and fear's even louder. When they returned to the wagon, Maggie paused before climbing up. She looked at the town, its weathered boards, its sparse traffic, the way people watched each other as if waiting for something to break. "Elias," she said softly, "why are people so quiet here?" He held the reins loosely, staring ahead. "Because Dust Valley's seen its fair share of trouble. Folks learned if they keep their heads down, trouble passes faster." "And you?" she asked gently. "Do you keep your head down too?" He hesitated. "Used to." Maggie looked at him carefully, not judging, just seeing him as he was. "Fear teaches a town to be silent," she said, "but silence can hold a man hostage." Elias turned toward her, his expression bare. "Are you speaking to me?" he asked, "or to yourself?" She held his gaze for a long moment, then answered, "Both. Summer, eh?" They started the journey home, the wagon creaking beneath them. Dust Valley faded behind them, leaving only the vast expanse of land stretching out in all directions. The wind softened. The sun warmed the tops of the sagebrush. A hawk circled overhead. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Maggie said quietly, "People in that town. They've been hurt." Elias nodded. "Hurt enough to stop speaking about it." "And Judge Lyman?" she asked. Elias's grip tightened on the reins. "Him most of all," he said. "He keeps the town quiet. Make sure of it." Maggie turned her gaze toward the horizon. "Then Dust Valley isn't just a place to start over," she murmured. "It's a place waiting to breathe again." Elias looked at her. Really looked. And he realized something simple but startling. This woman who arrived with only a small case and a quiet voice had seen more in Dust Valley within a single morning than he had allowed himself to see in years. The wind shifted, brushing cool air against their faces. Maggie drew her shawl closer. "Elias," she asked. "Yeah, you said Dust Valley keeps secrets poorly." "I did." She looked at him, her eyes steady but shadowed. "Then I fear mine may not stay buried here." He didn't know what to say. Because the truth was already unfolding inside him. Maggie hadn't just come to Dust Valley to escape. She had come to a place where the ground itself remembered injustice, where the silence was too heavy to ignore, where her secrets might echo louder than she hoped. And Elias, quiet, grieving, worn down, Elias felt a cold ripple of understanding. Whatever Maggie had run from might be following, and Dust Valley, for all its stillness, was about to stir. The wind changed that afternoon. It wasn't a loud change, nothing dramatic, just the kind of shift that made the sagebrush whisper in a slightly different direction, made the smell of the earth turn a shade drier, made the sky look as though it were watching more closely than before. Elias noticed it first. Ranchers always notice the sky. He tightened his grip on the wagon reins as he and Maggie rode back toward the ranch. The ride from town usually felt long and lonely, but today something unspoken rode with them. Something heavy, invisible, yet undeniable as the desert heat. Beside him, Maggie kept her shawl pulled tight, though the weather wasn't cold. Her eyes stayed trained on the horizon, calm yet distant, as if listening to something beyond the silence. After several miles, Elias finally asked, "You feelin' all right?" She hesitated just enough for him to notice. "Yes," she answered softly. "Just thinking about what happened in town, in part." The mule's hooves struck the ground in a slow, steady rhythm. Each thud echoed like a heartbeat in the open valley. Elias tried again. "If Boyd bothered you." "He didn't." Maggie cut in gently. "Not really. Men like him only know how to bark. It's men like Judge Lyman who know how to bite." Elias nodded. She was right. And that truth didn't sit easily. A dust devil twisted across the path ahead, spinning itself into nothing. Maggie watched it unravel. "Dust Valley isn't just a quiet town," she said finally. "It's a place that's learned to swallow its own voice." Elias swallowed. "People here don't choose silence," he said. "They just got tired of yelling when no one listened." Maggie looked at him. Really looked. Her eyes softened. "You don't strike me as someone who gives up easily." He took a slow breath. "I didn't used to." No judgment showed in her gaze, only understanding. "And now?" she asked. "Now?" Elias let the reins slacken a little. "I guess I keep my peace. Some things are easier to live with quiet." She didn't respond. Instead, she shifted her gaze back to the road. They reached the fork where the road narrowed, cutting between two tall, crumbling rock formations. The shadows here fell darker than the rest of the valley. and Elias always quickened his pace through this stretch. The mule slowed suddenly. Maggie noticed. "What's wrong?" she asked. Elias scanned the rocks. "Don't know," he murmured. "She don't usually spook." The mule snorted, stomping once. Then a crack. Sharp. Metallic. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a stone falling. It was a sound Dust Valley knew better than church bells. A rifle. Elias grabbed Maggie's arm instinctively. "Down," he hissed. They ducked low as a second shot ricocheted off the wagon's side panel, splintering wood into sharp fragments. The mule reared, braying, frantic and high. "Hold tight," Elias shouted. But Maggie wasn't frozen, not even for a heartbeat. She scanned the ridge with sharp precision. There she pointed, near the right outcrop. A figure moved just enough to catch the sunlight on metal. Elias reached for the old rifle kept under the wagon bench, but Maggie grabbed his wrist. "No, they're too high. You'll miss, and they won't." Her voice was steady, unshaken, controlled. Elias stared at her. "How in blazes do you? No time," she said. "We need to move. Now." The shooter's silhouette shifted again. Maggie grabbed the reins from Elias. "On my count," she said. 3, 2, now." She snapped the reins sharply and the mule shot forward, the wagon jolting so hard Elias had to grip the rail to keep from being thrown. Another gunshot cracked. Dirt exploded just inches from the wheel. Maggie kept her body low, hair whipping in the wind, eyes sharp as flint. The wagon barreled through the narrow pass wheels, rattling every jolt, threatening to topple them. Elias looked at her in disbelief. Her calm, her focus, the way her hands didn't shake even once. "Who taught you to handle a situation like this?" he yelled over the noise. Maggie's jaw tightened. "A life I didn't choose," she said. Elias had no answer for that, only silence chased by fear. Once they cleared the rocks, the shooter didn't follow. That pass was the only vantage point. There were no more shadows to hide in on open ground. The mule slowed, naturally panting. The world quieted, but the quiet now felt different. Sharper, thin as paper. Maggie straightened and brushed dust from her skirt. Her breaths came steady, controlled. Elias stared at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said calmly. Then she reached up, touched her hair, and removed 2 small chips of rock lodged in it. Elias's stomach twisted. "That weren't a random shot," he said. "Someone meant to hit us." Maggie didn't reply immediately. Instead, she lifted her gaze toward the ridge they had just escaped. "No," she murmured. "Not us." Her voice dropped to something fragile and cold. "Me." Elias felt the air leave his lungs. "You're saying someone followed you," he whispered. "I'm saying," Maggie replied, "that something from my past may not be finished. And Dust Valley isn't far enough." The words cut the air like a blade. They rode the rest of the way in silence, not peaceful silence, but one heavy with questions. Neither of them were ready to speak. When the ranch finally came into view, Maggie exhaled softly, almost relieved to see the house. Elias helped her down from the wagon, his hands brushing her sleeve without meaning to. She didn't pull away. Inside, the air felt cool and steady. The house always offered Elias comfort. But now he watched Maggie standing in the doorway, her breath just slightly uneven, eyes distant in a way he hadn't seen before. She wasn't shaken, she was assessing, measuring, calculating. A woman who had learned to survive danger, not run from it. Elias stepped closer, worry etched into the lines of his face. "Maggie, did someone mean you harm back where you came from?" She clasped her hands gently as though holding something delicate between them. "Yes," she whispered. "Someone powerful. Someone who doesn't like loose ends." Elias felt heat flood his chest, anger, fear, protectiveness. "You're safe here," he said firmly. She looked up, and in her eyes he saw gratitude wrapped in caution. "No one is ever truly safe," she replied softly. "Not when truth scares the wrong people." Elias swallowed. "What truth?" She held his gaze. "I'll tell you," she said. "But not tonight. Not while the fear is still loud in me." Elias nodded slowly. "I ain't going anywhere," he said. Something in her expression softened ever so slightly. "Thank you," Maggie murmured. She moved toward the stairs, pausing halfway. Then almost in a whisper she said, "Elias, the man who died back home, wasn't the only one with a reason to silence me." A chill swept through him. He didn't press further. Some truths needed to wait until a heart was ready to speak them. But as he stood alone in the quiet kitchen, Elias Merrick understood one thing clearer than he understood his own heartbeat. Maggie hadn't just brought sorrow with her. She had brought danger. Real danger. The kind that carried rifles and hid in shadows. And the moment she stepped off that train, Dust Valley had unknowingly stepped into her past. A past now crossing the desert. A past that remembered her. And a past that wasn't done. Night settled over Dust Valley like a soft, worn blanket, threadbare in places, but familiar in the way only old things could be. The moon hung low above the mesas, pale and swollen, casting silver across the dry fields of the Merrick Ranch. Elias walked the perimeter of his property with a lantern in hand, the warm glow flickering over the brittle sage and the worn fence posts. He'd walked these lines 1,000 times, but tonight each shadow felt sharper, each sound closer. Because someone had fired at them. Not at random. Not by accident. And Maggie believed the bullet was meant for her. The thought gnawed at Elias the way drought gnawed at his land, quietly, consistently, without mercy. As he neared the edge of the old creek bed, he spotted something in the dust. A mark. Small, almost delicate. He crouched, lifting the lantern. A footprint. Not his. Not Maggie's. Fresh. Someone had been on his land. He stared at it for a long time, the flame trembling in his grasp. He wasn't a man who dealt in panic. He had weathered storms louder than grief and quieter than death. But tonight, he felt a stirring he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not for himself. For her. He straightened slowly and turned back toward the house, the lantern swinging low as the wind carried the faintest whisper through the dry brush. A whisper that felt like warning. Inside the house, Maggie sat at the kitchen table, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't lit a lamp, only the moonlight streamed through the window, casting her features in soft gray. She looked calm. Too calm. But calm can hide tremors the way silence hides unsaid truths. Elias stepped inside quietly, trying not to startle her. "You should have slept," he said. Maggie didn't turn. "I couldn't," she replied softly. "Quiet nights make memories louder." He set the lantern down. "We ain't alone out there," he said, voice low. "Found footprints by the creek bed. Fresh ones." Maggie exhaled a small breath, but sharp at the edges. "So they found me," she murmured. "Even this far." Elias pulled out the chair across from hers. "You said someone wanted you silenced," he said. "But that rifleman, he didn't seem like no professional tracker. Shot too soon. Showed himself too quick." Maggie nodded. "Which means he wasn't sent by the man I feared most." "Then who?" Elias asked. She lifted her gaze to him. "Someone from Dust Valley." The room swallowed the words whole. Elias stared at her. "You think someone here knew you were coming? Or knew who you were?" "No," she answered. "I think someone here is afraid of what I know. And fears have a way of spreading faster than truth." Elias tried to steady his breath. "Maggie, tell me what's casing you." She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not to hide, but to gather strength. "When the man in my town died, the one they blamed me for, I found something in his office. Papers. Names. A connection stretching farther than the river town I lived in." She opened her eyes. "And one of those names belongs to someone here in Dust Valley." Elias felt the air thicken. Who? Maggie's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Judge Lyman." The name hung between them like a dead weight. Elias pushed back in his seat, breath caught in his throat. "You're certain I wouldn't be here if I wasn't?" The lantern flickered as if reacting to the truth laid bare. "Lyman and the man who died had ties," she continued. "Money passed between them. Favors exchanged. Records hidden. I found enough to make them nervous. Enough to make me disappear." Elias stared at her, heart pounding. "And that's why you came west." "Judge Lyman's reach is long," she said. "But Dust Valley is the one place where his past could be exposed. I came to see whether the corruption here matched the corruption I fled." Elias let out a slow breath, half awe, half fear. "You came here to fight him." "No," she said gently. "I came here to understand him, fight if necessary. Survive if possible." Elias shook his head. "Mag, you don't understand. Lyman controls half this town. The sheriff, the lands, the loans. Folks let him be. Because crossing him takes more courage than most can spare." Maggie folded her hands tighter. "I'm not asking the town to confront him," she said. "I only need the truth. And truth has a way of revealing itself when people stop pretending they don't see." Elias looked at her, no studied her. Her stillness, her strength wrapped in quiet, her fear tucked neatly beneath a layer of resolve. "You ain't a runaway bride," he said softly. "No," she whispered. "I never was. You ain't just someone looking for a new start." "No," she said again. She met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I came to Dust Valley because this is where a trail ends. And maybe where another begins." The house grew still. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows like an old friend with bad timing. Finally, Elias rose and moved to the cabinet above the stove. He opened it, reached inside, and pulled out a tin box. He set it on the table. The metal clicked softly under his fingers. "Got something to show you," he said. Inside the box lay a folded document worn thin with age edges frayed. Maggie looked at him, questioning. Elias pushed it toward her. She opened it carefully. It was a deed. Old. Very old. To land in Dust Valley. Signed by Elias's father and Judge Roscoe Lyman. A tremor passed through Maggie's breath. "You have history with him," she whispered. "More than most folks know," Elias said. "My pa trusted Lyman, thought he was helping the valley grow. But after he died, every interest rate climbed, every loan crushed the people owed to him, and every lie got thicker." Maggie lifted her eyes. "You never spoke of this, because no one wanted to hear it," he said. "And after a while I got tired of talking to walls." Maggie absorbed his words slowly, like someone piecing together a puzzle with trembling hands. "So you and I," she said softly, "carry different pieces of the same truth." "It seems that way," Elias replied. She closed the deed gently. "Then it means we were meant to cross paths." Elias blinked. Meant Maggie nodded, her voice a fragile whisper. "Two lives carrying parts of a story too heavy alone often find their way to each other." Elias felt something shift in his chest. Not love, not yet, but recognition, deep and quiet. A recognition of two people who had been wounded by the same shadow, though from different roads. He pulled in a breath. "So what now?" he asked. Maggie looked toward the dark window where the valley stretched far and silent. "Now," she said, "we understand the danger clearly." And after that, a long pause. "After that," she answered softly, "we decide whether to face it or run." Elias stepped closer, the lantern's glow warming the shadows around them. "I ain't running, Maggie." She looked at him, truly looked, her eyes hesitant but full. "Then neither am I," she whispered. Outside, the wind quieted. The ranch seemed to settle, readying itself. Inside, two people who had once come to this place, searching for peace, now realized they were standing on the edge of a storm that carried Judge Roscoe Lyman's name, and a past that remembered the footprints Maggie Rowe once tried to leave behind. The sky over Dust Valley turned the color of cold iron the next morning, flat, gray, and silent. Clouds drifted low, hanging just above the mesas like a weight the land could not shake off. It was a rare sight. Dust Valley was known for its light, its heat, its merciless openness. But today the sky looked like it was thinking. And its thoughts were heavy. Elias noticed the shift before he even stepped out onto the porch. Something in the air felt taut, stretched thin. It wasn't danger, it wasn't that sharp. It was something subtler. Expectation. As if the valley itself knew a truth was circling, ready to land. Inside, Maggie stood at the wash basin, folding her hair beneath a simple tie. Her movements were careful, almost ceremonial. Elias watched from the doorway, taking in the way she tied the knot twice, securing it not out of vanity but resolve. "You're quiet this morning," he said softly. She didn't turn. "Some mornings aren't made for talking," she replied. He stepped farther in. "You slept it all, enough," she answered. But the slight tremor in her hand told another story. Elias wanted to reach for that hand to steady it, but held himself back. He respected her space too much to cross into it without being invited. "I found wagon tracks near the creek before sunrise," he said. "Fresh ones." Maggie looked up sharply. Her eyes sharpened the way a blade finds its edge. "How many tracks?" she asked. "Just one wagon, heavy load, deep prints. And heading," he hesitated, "toward town." She exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief moment. "So news travels fast." Elias frowned. "I didn't tell a soul." "You didn't need to," she said. "Fear has its own messengers." They ate breakfast in tense silence. Elias had fried a couple of eggs and warmed leftover cornbread, but Maggie barely touched her plate. She sat still, hands folded, gaze drifting toward the window. When she finally spoke, it was without warning. I need to go back into town. Elias nearly dropped his fork. You, what, Maggie, after yesterday, after the rifle? I know what happened, she said calmly. But running from shadows only teaches them to follow closer. Elias shook his head. You ain't running. But going back into Dust Valley right now is asking for trouble. Trouble will find me whether I stay or go, she answered softly. But in town, at least I can see it coming. He set his fork down slowly. You're not alone in this now, he said. Whatever's chasing you, whatever truth you're holding is on both of us now. She looked at him then. Really looked. Elias, are you sure? You don't owe me that? He leaned back, hands on the table. Maybe I don't owe you, he said quietly. But I choose it. Something in her softened just barely. Then we go together. The road to Dust Valley felt different this time. Less lonely. More dangerous. Wind blew low across the ground, stirring up loose dirt. The sky remained gray, its weight pushing down on the land. Even the mule seemed uneasy, ears twitching at small sounds Elias couldn't hear. Halfway to town, Maggie spoke without turning her head. There's something I haven't told you. Something important. Elias kept his eyes on the road. I figured there might be more. She swallowed. The man who died, back in Missouri, his name was Charles Hargrove. Elias stiffened. That name means something to you, Maggie asked. He nodded slowly. Lyman's mentioned that name. Once, maybe twice. In business talk, always quiet-like as if speaking of a ghost. He should, Maggie said. They weren't just partners. They were thieves together. Elias's jaw tightened. And you knew something they didn't want known. Yes, not because I was spying or meddling, just because I was close enough to see the pieces. Too many pieces. She closed her eyes briefly. Hargrove trusted too many people with too many secrets. And when secrets get heavy, someone always collapses under them. And you paid the price, Elias murmured. Maggie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Ragsure. Wud. When they reached the edge of town, Dust Valley felt different. People stood outside their shops, but instead of the usual morning rhythm, sweeping, watering horses, counting inventory, they were watching. Not openly, but watching. Elias felt the weight of their eyes. Maggie felt their judgment. Both felt the danger. Clara Winslet stepped off her porch the moment she saw them. Elias Merrick, you bring that woman here today, she whispered fiercely. She's got business, Elias replied, trying to keep his tone even. Business, Clara hissed. Boyd's been pacing since dawn like a dog that smelled something foul. And Lyman's shut himself in that courthouse of his. Something stirred them. Maggie stepped forward. Clara, she said gently. Did anyone come asking about me? Clara hesitated. Yes. Elias's stomach dropped. Maggie stayed calm. Who? Clara looked over her shoulder, then leaned in. A man in a long coat, didn't give a name. Asked questions about strangers. Asked who Elias brought home. Asked if you looked dangerous. And what did you say? Maggie asked softly. Clara held her gaze. I told him I'd seen far more dangerous rattlesnakes than you. A faint smile tugged at Maggie's mouth. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Clara muttered. He wasn't satisfied. Rode out toward the northern ridges. Man like that wasn't looking, he was tracking. Elias felt cold settle at the base of his spine. Maggie stood still. So someone from outside did follow, she murmured. Clara lowered her voice. Whatever you've got tied to you, girl. It's dragging trouble across half the West. Maggie nodded. I know. Clara's face softened. If you need help, real help, you ask me. Dust Valley may be tired, but we ain't heartless. Maggie touched Clara's arm lightly. That means more than you know. Elias and Maggie continued toward the courthouse, though every instinct in Elias screamed to turn back. You sure you want to face Lyman? He asked. No, she answered honestly. But if power breeds fear, then silence breeds rot. He looked at her, this woman who had walked into his life with soft hands, steady eyes, and a past full of storms. You ain't afraid of Lyman? She asked. Yes. Terrified. Then why walk toward him? Because fear loses its teeth once you stop running. Elias swallowed hard. You're something else, Maggie. She gave a faint smile. I've had to be. The courthouse door loomed ahead, tall, weathered, stiff with authority. Maggie stopped before it and breathed in slowly. Elias reached for the handle. Before he could open it, the door swung wide. Judge Roscoe Lyman stood there. Tall, perfectly dressed, eyes sharp as a hawk's talon. He looked first at Maggie, then at Elias, then back at Maggie again. "Well," Lyman said, voice silky as cold water. "The mail-order bride who's been stirring dust in my town." Elias stiffened. Maggie didn't. She lifted her chin, her voice calm. "Judge Lyman, we should talk." "Oh, we will," Lyman said. "But not here." He stepped aside, gesturing them in, but his smile never reached his eyes. It was the smile of a man who already believed the outcome was his. Maggie walked forward without flinching. Elias followed, feeling danger coil around them like a tightening lasso. And Dust Valley, silent, watching, waiting, felt the storm gather. Because Judge Roscoe Lyman had just seen the past walk straight into his courthouse. And the truth long buried had begun to drag its bones to the surface. The courthouse smelled of old paper and older secrets. The heavy oak door closed behind Elias and Maggie with a thud that echoed longer than it should have. Judge Roscoe Lyman led the way inside, his polished boots tapping rhythmically on the wooden floor. Each tap felt intentional, like he wanted them to listen not to his steps but to his authority. Maggie walked beside Elias, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted with quiet defiance. She didn't appear afraid, yet something in the way she clasped her hands said she was bracing herself against whatever was coming. Lyman gestured toward a pair of chairs positioned in front of his desk. "Sit," he said, his voice smooth but void of warmth. "This conversation requires formality." Elias remained standing. "We ain't here for formalities," he said. "We're here for truth." Lyman smiled faintly. "A noble concept," he replied, "and such a difficult one for people to handle. Please, Mr. Merrick, have a seat." Elias didn't move. Maggie, however, sat slowly, her expression unreadable. Lyman watched her carefully, too carefully, like a man studying an opponent he had underestimated before, but didn't intend to again. "You caused quite a stir yesterday," he said. "Shots fired out by the ridge. Rumors flying in from the Winslet store. A stranger asking about a stranger." His eyes narrowed. "Care to explain?" Maggie crossed her hands neatly on her lap. "Explain what?" Judge Lyman leaned back in his chair. "Let's not play games. That rifle shot was aimed at someone. It would be convenient to assume it was a bandit or a drunk. But convenience rarely aligns with truth." Elias stepped forward. "Someone followed her from Missouri." Lyman didn't even blink. "A bold accusation. And one that conveniently lacks evidence." Maggie tilted her head slightly. "And yet you seem very informed about it." Lyman's jaw twitched just enough for Maggie to notice. He cleared his throat. "It is my duty to remain informed about events that threaten the town." Maggie folded her hands tighter. "Then you should know," she said softly, "that I'm not here to threaten it." Lyman smiled without his eyes. "No, I believe you're here to threaten me." Elias's breath hardened. Maggie didn't look away. "I'm here," she said calmly, "because a man named Charles Hargrove died. A man connected to you." Lyman's fingers froze above the ledgers on his desk. Elias saw it. Maggie saw it. But Lyman tried to mask it behind a cold smile. "Hargrove," he said slowly, "was a business associate. Nothing more." "Business associates don't send money in unmarked envelopes," Maggie replied. "They don't hide transactions under false names. They don't share coded letters at midnight." A silence thickened the air, pressing down like a storm waiting to break. Lyman clasped his hands gently on his desk. "Miss Rowe," he said, "you are a mail-order bride. A drifter. A woman with a tarnished reputation and an imagination sharpened by fear." "Whatever you think you know, I don't think," Maggie interrupted. Her voice was still soft, still polite, but it stopped Lyman mid-sentence. "I know." Lyman's eyes darkened. Elias's pulse quickened. Maggie continued. "I know Charles Hargrove kept a ledger of names. Men he worked with. Men he bribed. Men he feared. Your name was on that list." Elias swallowed. "And I know," she added, "that he died because someone didn't want that ledger to be found." Lyman leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "And you expect me to believe you simply left that ledger behind? That you wandered west with nothing but a suitcase and a memory of a crime?" Maggie's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't leave it behind." Lyman stilled. Elias's breath caught. Then Maggie reached into her shawl and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, thin, fragile edges worn. A page, ripped carefully, deliberately. Lyman's eyes widened a fraction. Maggie saw it. Elias saw it. Maggie placed the torn page on Lyman's desk, sliding it forward with steady fingers. It contained a list of names. One of them circled. Roscoe Lyman. You left Missouri, Maggie said quietly, but I didn't leave everything behind. Lyman stared at the page, breathing slow and controlled. You stole this, he said. No, Maggie answered. I kept it. Because if I hadn't, I'd be dead. Elias stepped forward. That shooter out by the ridge, he part of this. Lyman's face hardened. This is absurd. You're right, Maggie said. Absurd that you thought truth would stay buried just because you told people not to dig. Lyman stood abruptly. You will hand over the rest of that ledger. Now. Maggie didn't move. There is no rest of it, she said. Only this page. The only one Hargrove didn't destroy. Lyman's face drained of color. He intended to burn his records, Maggie continued. He didn't want to go down alone. But he misjudged how afraid the men on that list were. You're lying, Lyman snapped. No, Maggie said softly. I'm alive. That's what scares you. Elias stepped between them, jaw set. Judge, if you're mixed up in something dirty, you best start speaking the truth. Folks in town deserve to know who they're trustin'. Lyman's voice lowered to a dangerous whisper. You're a fool, Merrick. Maybe, Elias said. But I ain't blind. Lyman straightened his coat composure, returning like a mask sliding into place. You two should leave, he said, before you walk into matters far above your understanding. No, Maggie replied. Her voice was steady, calm, unshakable. We're not leaving. Lyman stared at her long, slow, cold. You think Dust Valley will choose your word over mine, a stranger, a woman with no proof, no allies, no past she can show without shame. I don't need the town to choose, Maggie said. Truth chooses itself. Lyman leaned in his voice, barely a breath. And truth can be buried. Maggie held his gaze. Not forever. A muscle in Lyman's jaw pulsed. Then he reached for the paper. Elias stepped forward, blocking him. You won't touch it. Lyman's eyes flicked between them, calculating cold. You both just made a terrible mistake. Elias held firm. So be it. Lyman smoothed his coat, his smile returning. A smile that didn't just hide danger. It promised it. Dust Valley has long arms, he murmured, and longer memories. Maggie rose slowly from her seat. Then you should remember this too, she said. I didn't come here to hide. Lyman raised an eyebrow. No, I came to finish what Hargrove started. Lyman's expression cracked for the briefest instant. Fear. Real fear. A flicker so small it might have been imagined. But Maggie saw it. And Elias saw it. And that flicker told them everything. Judge Roscoe Lyman was not untouchable. He was terrified. And fear makes a desperate man dangerous. Maggie stepped back, her voice soft but unyielding. You buried truths in Dust Valley, she whispered, but you forgot something important. What's that? Lyman asked through clenched teeth. Maggie met his gaze. Dust doesn't stay buried. Elias opened the courthouse door. Maggie walked out. He followed close behind. Lyman stood in the doorway watching them go, his shadow stretching long across the floor. And as the door closed with a heavy thud, Maggie whispered, The storm's coming. Elias nodded. And we're standing right in its path. The sky above Dust Valley remained gray, unmoving, expectant, as if the wind itself knew the truth had taken its first breath, and Dust Valley would never be quiet again. Dust Valley changed in a single afternoon. Word traveled quicker than horses, quicker than the wind rolling across the mesas. By the time Elias and Maggie walked out of the courthouse, half the town knew they had gone in, and the other half waited to hear what had happened behind that heavy oak door. Now all eyes followed them, not openly, not boldly, but with that sideways lingering curiosity that small towns perfected, watching without watching, judging without speaking. Theo Klein stepped out of his blacksmith shop the moment he saw them. His apron hung crooked, his hands dusted with soot, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Elias, Theo called out, voice low, come here a minute. Elias guided Maggie toward him. Theo glanced at her with a subtle nod, respectful but tense. I don't know what happened in that courthouse, Theo said quietly, but Lyman looked like a spooked horse when he walked out after you. Whatever you said to him. It struck deep. Maggie answered calmly. Truth tends to do that. Theo's jaw tightened. Truth's powerful, he said. But powerful things get broken in places like this. Elias felt tension coil in his stomach. You heard something, he asked. Theo wiped his hands on his apron, leaning in even closer. Sheriff Boyd's been talking with two men I've never seen before. One arrived last night. The other early this morning. They met behind the saloon, quiet-like, but not quiet enough. They're looking for someone. Maggie didn't react. But Elias felt her breath still beside him. Theo lowered his voice to a whisper. And Elias, they ain't looking for Lyman. Clara Winslet approached from across the street, broom in hand, her face tight with worry. I told you, Clara said. Storm's coming. And it's coming fast. Maggie stepped toward Clara, her voice soft but resolute. Do people know who those men are? One of 'em's traveling under the name Mr. Hart, Clara said. But that ain't his real name. Man's too careful with his words, too clean with his boots. A man who's been nowhere leaves no dust. Maggie's hands folded at her waist. Then he's not from here. No, Clara said. He's from your past, I reckon. He asked questions about you. Elias felt heat surge through him. What kind of questions? Clara looked at Maggie with the compassion that only old age provides. He asked, if you were alone, if you were frightened, if you were worth protecting. Maggie's eyes lowered. A subtle motion, like a small door closing. Clara placed a gentle hand on her arm. Child, she whispered, you got danger knotted all around you. But you ain't alone in it no more. Elias stepped closer to Maggie. She's right, he said. You ain't facing this by yourself. Maggie breathed in slowly. I know, but her voice carried something else beneath it, a fragile thread of fear, thin and trembling. Not fear of the men who hunted her. Fear of the people she might bring harm to. As they began their walk back to the wagon, Dust Valley's silence pressed in around them. People stood in doorways, leaning against posts or pretending to sweep dust that didn't need sweeping. Elias felt their judgment like heat on his neck. Maggie felt their uncertainty like cold fingers around her ribs. At the far end of the street, Sheriff Boyd Halpern stepped out of the saloon. His hat was pulled low, his badge glinting sharply in the sun. Two strangers followed him, one tall and narrow, the other short and broad-shouldered, both wearing dusters that didn't belong in a desert town. Boyd smirked when he saw Elias and Maggie. Well, well, the sheriff drawled. Look who's strolling through town like they own the place. Elias stiffened. We ain't causing trouble, he said. Just passing through. Boyd stepped closer. It ain't you I'm worried about, he said. It's her. Maggie lifted her chin. You don't even know me, Sheriff. I know enough, Boyd said. A woman arrives with shadows on her heels. Judge Lyman gets riled up. Strangers follow. Dust Valley don't need that kind of excitement. The tall stranger studied Maggie with an unsettling calm. You're Margaret Rowe, he asked. Maggie didn't answer. Elias stepped in front of her. State your business, he demanded. The man smiled thinly. My business is history, he said. And Miss Rowe here has a history that's caught the interest of several important people. Maggie's voice came soft but firm. Important people who are afraid of truth. The man's eyes sharpened. You have something that belongs to them. Elias's heart pounded. Maggie held her ground. If they want it, she said, they should have considered that before killing the man who kept it. The broad-shouldered man stepped forward. You're a bold woman. Maggie looked at him steadily. No, I'm a tired one. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe. Respect, possibly. But Boyd's hand slid toward his holster. Enough talk, Boyd said. Elias, you best step aside. Elias didn't move. You ain't touching her. Boyd's lip curled. She's bringing danger onto this town. She's bringing truth, Elias snapped. Something Dust Valley forgot how to handle. A murmur rippled through the people nearby. Small, uneasy, growing. Boyd's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake, Merrick. No, Elias said. I'm making a choice. The tall stranger took a step forward. Move, he said. Elias planted his feet. I ain't moving. Maggie stepped to Elias's side, her voice low but steady. Enough, she whispered. They won't shoot in front of the town. Not yet. Boyd scowled, realizing she was right. The stranger stepped back, but only slightly. "We're not done here," the tall one said. "Then pick a day," Maggie replied, "and face me in the open." Elias's blood chilled. Boyd barked a dry laugh. "You think the law's gonna protect you?" "No," Maggie said. "I don't expect protection from men who use the law to hide their sins." The street fell silent. Boyd's face reddened, but he didn't draw his gun. Not with half the town watching. Not with whispers starting to drift like sparks. Clara hurried to Elias and Maggie once the sheriff left. "You two need to leave now," she said. "Go home before Boyd finds his nerve." Elias nodded. Maggie's voice barely rose. "He won't stop." "No, he won't," Clara replied. "But danger doesn't need to catch you while you stand in the open." They reached the wagon as quickly as pride allowed. Elias helped Maggie climb up, then took the reins. His hands shook faintly, not from fear, but from something fierce and unfamiliar. Protectiveness, deep and heavy. As they rode out of Dust Valley, Maggie stared back at the courthouse, at the saloon, at the sheriff, at the strangers whose eyes tracked the wagon until it vanished from sight. "You see what's happenin'," Elias said quietly. "Yes," Maggie replied. "Dust Valley's splittin'," he said. "Some are scared of you. Others are scared of the truth you carry." She nodded. "And which frightens you more?" she asked softly. Elias inhaled, steady and slow. "I ain't scared of you." She looked at him, searching for something honest. "And the truth," she whispered. He tightened his grip on the reins. "Truth's the only thing worth standin' for." Her breath trembled just barely. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" "For not looking at me the way they do." Elias shook his head. "I look at you," he said quietly, the way a man looks at someone he refuses to lose. Maggie's eyes glistened with something fragile. Not tears, not sorrow. Recognition. Two wounded souls standing side by side in a storm that didn't care who broke first. And Dust Valley, silent watching, felt the whisper of upheaval under its dusty, cracked surface. A storm was coming, closer than anyone knew. And the first lightning had already struck. By the time Elias and Maggie reached the ranch, the sun hung low over the desert hills, turning the sky into a wash of orange and bruised violet. The fading light stretched long shadows across the fields, the kind of shadows that looked too much like figures standing still. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch. Neither of them moved for a moment. The silence felt heavier than usual, like the land was holding its breath. Finally, Elias spoke. "Maggie," he said, voice quiet but edged with worry, "this ain't something we can pretend will blow over." She nodded slowly. "I know." He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in him twisted. Her face was tired, her eyes ringed with the weight of too many truths. She wasn't a woman running from trouble. She was a woman walking toward it because there was no other choice. "Let's get inside," he murmured. The house felt unusually cold as they stepped in, even though the day's heat still clung to the walls. Elias lit a lantern, its glow warm but weak against the growing darkness. Maggie stood near the window, her hands clasped tightly, watching the sky shift from violet to deep blue. Elias set the lantern down and turned to her. "You okay?" She didn't answer at first. When she did, her voice was soft, controlled. "Back in Missouri. The night before Charles Hargrove died. The sky looked just like this." Elias stilled. Maggie continued, her gaze distant. "He told me he was afraid. Not of dying, but of being silenced. He said men like Lyman and Hart, they don't kill for revenge. They kill for control." She wrapped her arms around herself as though trying to hold in the cold. "And when I found him the next morning, it was too late." Elias stepped closer. "You couldn't have saved him." Maggie closed her eyes. "That doesn't stop me from wondering if I might have." The lantern flickered, throwing shadows across her face, shadows that made her look older, wiser, and unbearably fragile. "Maggie," Elias said softer now, "you didn't cause any of this." "No," she whispered, "but I'm the only one left who knows why he died. That puts blood on my heels anywhere I go." Elias took a slow breath. "Not here," he said. "You ain't facing this alone anymore." Her eyes glistened with something deep and quiet. "Thank you," she murmured, "for standing with me, even when it might cost you more than you bargained for." Elias shook his head. "It ain't a bargain. It's a choice." And it was one he made without hesitation. As night settled in, Elias double-checked the doors, the windows, the rifle by the bed. He wasn't a man given to paranoia, but he wasn't a fool either. Dust Valley had rarely been dangerous, but tonight, danger felt near enough to touch. He walked back into the main room and found Maggie seated on the small sofa, staring into the lantern flame as though it held answers. "Talk to me," he said gently. "What's weighing on you now?" She took a long breath before speaking. "I'm not afraid of dying, Elias. I've lived through worse nights than this." She paused, her eyes softening. "I'm afraid of bringing danger to your door. This ranch has suffered enough." Elias sat beside her. "You didn't bring danger," he said. "Truth did, and truth has a way of finding its way home." She looked at him, brow furrowed. "You really believe that I do?" She gave a small, sad smile. "You're kinder than you realize." He shook his head. "I'm just a man who's tired of watching wrong men win." Something loosened in Maggie's posture, like a knot she'd held too long, finally easing. "Tell me something," she said quietly. "Why do you trust me? You barely know me." Elias leaned back against the sofa. "Because you didn't come here pretending to be something you're not. You didn't lie to make yourself look better. You spoke truth even when it put your life at risk. Folks who do that ain't dangerous, they're desperate and brave." She blinked slowly. "You see me clearer than most men ever tried to." He turned his gaze toward the window. "I see you because you remind me of someone I used to be." Her breath hitched. And who was that? A man who believed truth could change something. A man who didn't look away when something wrong was right in front of him. Maggie lowered her eyes. "I like that man," she whispered. "So do I," Elias said softly. "And I'd like to find him again." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. A faint crunch of gravel snapped both their heads toward the window. Elias stood immediately. Maggie rose beside him. Another crunch. Slow. Deliberate. Someone was outside. Elias grabbed the rifle from the mantel. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Maggie shook her head. "No, I won't hide. This ain't about pride," he said. "Neither is this," she answered quietly. She stepped to his side, close enough that their shoulders brushed. A shadow moved near the barn. Elias lifted the rifle halfway. "Show yourself," he called. Silence. Wind rattled the dry grass outside the porch. Then, a voice. Rough. Uneven. Familiar. "Elias." "It's me." Theo Klein stepped into the lantern, glow hands visible, breathing hard. Elias lowered the rifle, exhaling sharply. "Damn it, Theo," he muttered, stepping onto the porch. "You near got yourself shot." Theo didn't smile. "Sorry," he said, "but I couldn't wait till morning. I saw something." "Something you both need to know." Maggie came to the doorway, eyes sharp. "What is it?" Theo looked at her, really looked, with worry, and a weight that didn't come from gossip or guesswork. "Those two men, the ones with the sheriff, they ain't here just to question you." Elias stiffened. Theo swallowed. "They're staying at the old mill outside town. Sheriff Boyd brought 'em there himself. And I overheard them." Maggie's breath lowered into her chest. "What did they say?" Theo shifted nervously. "They said Lyman's laws and patience. Said if the woman meaning you won't hand over what she's got." He hesitated. Maggie's voice stayed steady. "Say it, Theo. They said they'll take it from you, one way or another." The lantern inside the house flickered. Maggie didn't flinch. Elias did. "You sure?" he demanded. Theo nodded. "And there's something else," he added, voice growing tight. "Sheriff Boyd didn't just bring 'em food and whiskey." He paused. "He brought 'em a map." Elias's eyes widened. A map of what Theo's answer dropped like a stone. "Your ranch." A cold, heavy silence settled across the porch, the kind that warned of storms no wind could predict. Maggie's voice came soft, barely above a whisper. "They're coming here." Theo nodded once. "Tonight." Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. Maggie straightened her eyes, dark but unwavering. "Then we prepare," she said. Elias looked at her, heart pounding with something fierce and undeniable. Not fear. Not regret. Resolve. "You ain't fighting alone," he said. Maggie lifted her chin. "I never expected to." And for the first time since coming to Dust Valley, she let her hand touch his briefly, steadying him as much as herself. The night deepened. The wind hushed. And the valley waited. Because danger was no longer approaching. It was already here. and the darkness at the edge of the ranch would not leave quietly. Night wrapped around the Merrick Ranch like a dark cloak, thick, unmoving, expectant. The kind of night where breath fogged in front of lanterns and the silence felt like something alive, listening, waiting. Elias stood in the yard with his rifle lantern placed on a fence post, casting a thin circle of gold into the darkness. The air held the metallic scent of coming danger, and every instinct in his body tightened. Inside the house, Maggie paced slowly, her steps measured, her mind sharper than fear. She moved like a woman who had walked through storms before and learned you can't reason with lightning, only face it with your feet planted in truth. Theo stayed near the barn shotgun, resting in the crook of his arm. For a man in his 60s, he stood with the resolve of someone who knew when history demanded presence. Elias breathed in the cold air. Then he heard it. Main beats. Slow. Heavy. Approaching from the north. He turned toward the sound. "They're here," he said quietly. Maggie stepped out from the house lantern light, catching the edges of her face. She wasn't trembling, but something in her eyes, some old echo of loss, seemed to brace itself. "Stay behind me," Elias murmured. "No," she said softly. "Truth doesn't hide." The hoofbeats grew louder. 3 shapes emerged from the dark, 2 riders and 1 wagon. The horses snorted clouds of steam as they reached the yard. Sheriff Boyd Halpern sat on one of them, posture rigid. Mr. Hart rode beside him, cold eyes trained on Maggie. The broad-shouldered man held the wagon reins, expression empty as a stone. Boyd spat into the dirt. "Even in Merrick," he said. "We come for what's ours." Elias didn't lift his rifle, but he held it firm. "You got no claim here, Boyd." "It ain't me claimin'," Boyd said. "It's the law." Maggie stepped forward. "No," she said. "It's Lyman." Hart smiled thinly. "Smart woman." Theo moved closer, shotgun angled. "You best rethink whatever you're plannin'," Theo grunted. "This ain't Missouri. Folks here shoot back." Hart didn't even glance at him. "This doesn't concern you," he said. Theo spat. "It damn well does." Boyd frowned at Maggie. "You should have handed over that letter, Miss Rowe." She met his gaze without blinking. It wasn't a letter. It was a ledger. Hart's hand tightened on his reins. Maggie continued, "And now the judge is desperate. Because if truth reaches the territorial marshal, everything he built here turns to dust." Hart's voice lowered to a dangerous calm. "That's why we're ending this tonight." Elias stepped in front of Maggie before he even realized he'd moved. "You'll get to her over my dead body." Hart's smile widened. "That's the plan." The broad-shouldered man reached into the wagon, and the ground answered before he did. A gunshot cracked across the yard, sharp, echoing off the empty corrals. Theo fired first. The broad-shouldered man staggered back, dropping the rifle he'd been reaching for. Boyd cursed, ducking behind his horse. Everything exploded into motion. Hart drew his weapon. Elias fired. Maggie pulled Theo behind a wagon wheel. Boyd screamed orders. Horses panicked. The lantern on the fence flickered violently, and through it all, Maggie moved like a woman who had lived this nightmare once, refused to live it twice. She ducked low, grabbed the fallen broad-shouldered man's saddlebag, ripping it open. Inside, a bundle of papers. Her breath caught. Proof. Letters. Receipts. Names. Seals bearing Lyman's signature. A lifetime of lies, wrapped in parchment. "Maggie," Elias shouted. She turned just as Hart raised his gun toward Elias's back. Without thinking, Maggie stepped out fully into the open. "Enough." Her voice cut through the chaos like a bell struck clean. Hart hesitated. "Only a fraction, but enough." Maggie held the papers high. "You kill us," she said, "and these go to the marshal." "Lyman's finished." Hart's jaw clenched. "You're bluffing." "No," she whispered. "I'm exhausted." For the first time, Hart's eyes flickered. Doubt. Small but present. Boyd looked around the yard, the guns, the witnesses, his authority bleeding out like water from a cracked bucket. "This is madness," Boyd muttered. "Ain't worth dying for." Hart ignored him. "Hand them over," Hart said. "Now, Miss Rowe." Maggie stepped backward toward Elias. "No." Hart drew his pistol higher. Elias aimed his rifle. And then hoofbeats thundered from the south. Everyone froze. A rider galloped into the yard, dust and cold night trailing behind him. Under lantern light, his badge gleamed. A.U.S. Marshal. Marshal Avery Holt. Known across 3 counties. Quiet, fair, and feared by men with something to hide. He pulled his horse to a stop, raised his voice with a calm authority that cut the night clean in half. "Drop your weapons." Boyd hesitated. Hart didn't. Elias fired not to kill but to throw off Hart's aim. The shot struck Hart's gun hand, sending his pistol spinning into the dirt. Hart cried out. Marshal Holt vaulted off his horse. "In the name of the United States," he shouted, "you're all under my jurisdiction now." He moved like a man who'd seen too many nights like this, too many lies printed on fine paper. "Which one of you is Margaret Rowe?" Holt asked. Maggie stepped forward, hands still gripping the papers. "I am." "Did you send a message to the marshal's office in Missouri?" Holt asked. Maggie's breath hitched. "No," she said. "I never had the chance." Holt nodded. "Someone did." He turned his gaze on the wagon. "Those documents, hand them here." Maggie handed them over, her fingers trembling only at the edges. Holt flipped through them, his face hardening with every line. "Hargrove," Holt murmured. "Lyman. Bribes. Forgeries. Land theft." Hart glared, his wounded hand bleeding. "This is a mistake," Hart growled. "No," Holt said, "this is justice catching up." He looked at Boyd. "Sheriff Halpern, you are hereby relieved of your badge until further review." Boyd paled. Elias exhaled shakily. Maggie stood unmoving. Holt turned to Hart. "And you, Gerald Hart, you're wanted in 2 states for obstruction of justice and the disappearance of Charles Hargrove." Hart tried to stand straighter. "Lyman will bury you," Hart hissed. "No," Holt said quietly, "Lyman's already buried himself." "Then," Holt looked at Maggie, "you've carried this burden a long time, Miss Rowe." Her voice wavered for the first time. "Yes," she whispered. "You're safe now." The words hit her harder than any threat ever had. Her knees softened. Elias caught her before she fell. An hour later, Hart and the broad-shouldered man were cuffed and loaded into the marshal's wagon. Boyd stood off to the side, stripped of his badge, stripped of power. Theo leaned on his shotgun, exhausted, and Elias stood beside Maggie as dawn crept across the horizon. Soft, pale, new. Maggie looked toward the light spreading across the desert. "It's over," she whispered. Elias shook his head gently. "No, it's beginning." She turned toward him, eyes glistening. "Elias, I never meant to bring this here." He took her hands. "You brought truth," he said simply. "And truth is the only thing that grows in dry places." A tear finally escaped her eye. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered. Elias brushed her cheek with the back of his fingers, gentle, steady. "Then stay," he said. "Till you do." She leaned into his touch, the first true sign that her walls built from grief, fear, and long roads were finally cracking. I think she whispered that for the first time in years. "I want to." The sun climbed higher. The desert warmed. And Dust Valley, after years of silence, breathed. 2 wounded souls stood together in the new light, their past no longer chasing them, their futures newly unwritten. The storm had come. The truth had stood. And love, quiet, steady, courage born, began to take root in the soft soil of dawn. The story He Ordered a Mail-Order Bride reminds us that every person, no matter how silent or strong, carries wounds that outsiders cannot see. And sometimes the presence of a stranger is the key to open the door to healing. In old age, everyone has experienced loss, been misunderstood, and been so tired that they wanted to give up. But the story of Elias and Maggie shows us something simple yet profound. When we dare to face our fears, dare to believe again, life can still bloom. Love can come at any age if we still have the courage to open our hearts. And the truth, no matter how long it is buried, will one day rise up and free those who have endured it. Thank you, the audience, who have always accompanied and sympathized. If the story brings you a little warmth, I hope you will like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue with me on other healing journeys. Thanks from the heart.